Mom said I'm not family anymore. Then she needed a kidney. Hi everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. I remember the exact moment she threw away my drawing. I was 8, maybe 9. I'd spent the entire afternoon at the kitchen table, tongue poking out in concentration, carefully coloring a house with a red roof and yellow walls. 2 stick figures stood in front, a small one labeled me, and a tall one labeled Mom. I'd even drawn a sun with sunglasses because I thought it was funny. When she came home from work, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown timer, I ran to show her. She was already rifling through the mail, her mouth set in that thin line that meant she was calculating something. Bills, probably, or the ways I disappointed her that day. Mom, look! I held up the drawing, my small fingers leaving smudges on the edges. She glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds. David, this is messy. Look at these lines. They're all over the place. And why's the sun wearing sunglasses? That doesn't make sense. I felt my chest deflate like a punctured balloon. I thought it was funny. Funny doesn't pay the bills. She took the drawing and walked straight to the trash can. The sound of paper hitting the bottom still echoes in my head sometimes, 32 years later. The next week, when my sister Emily drew a butterfly, a simple, crooked butterfly with purple wings. Mom hung it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a strawberry. Emily was only 6, but somehow her lines were so artistic and showed real potential. That's when I first understood the rules of our house. Emily was the sun, and I was the planet that existed only to reflect her light. The pattern continued through elementary school, middle school, high school. Emily's piano recitals were attended by both parents and grandparents, her performances recorded and sent to relatives. When I joined the debate team and made it to state finals, Mom said she had to work late that day. Dad came, sat in the back, and left during the lunch break. You argued well, he said in the car afterward, but you were a little aggressive. You need to learn when to back down. I wanted to tell him that backing down was all I ever did, that I'd spent my entire childhood backing down, shrinking, making myself smaller so Emily could shine brighter. But I just nodded and stared out the window at the passing trees. At home, Mom was helping Emily with her college applications. Emily wanted to study art history at a small liberal arts college in Vermont, expensive and impractical. But somehow when Emily said it, it sounded like a dream worth pursuing. When I mentioned wanting to study computer science, Mom frowned. That's such a cold field, David. All those hours alone with a computer. Don't you want to do something more meaningful? Meaningful. Like art history, apparently. The breaking point came during my senior year of high school. I'd been dating Sarah Chen since sophomore year. Quietly, carefully. Because I'd learned early that bringing attention to my choices usually meant inviting criticism. Sarah was smart and funny, with plans to study engineering. She had immigrant parents who worked 2 jobs each and still managed to save money for her education. She understood what it meant to earn things. But Sarah wasn't what my mother had envisioned for me. She wasn't from the right kind of family, didn't move in the right circles. When Mom finally met her at graduation, she was polite but cold. After Sarah left, Mom cornered me in the kitchen. She seems nice, Mom said, in the tone she used when she meant the opposite. But David, you have to think about your future, about the kind of life you want to build, the kind of family you want to be part of. I am thinking about my future. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're throwing away every opportunity we've given you. The connections, the advantages. For what? Some girl you'll probably break up with in college anyway? I felt that familiar heat rising in my chest, the anger I usually swallowed. Her name is Sarah, and I love her. Mom laughed. Actually laughed. Love, you're 18 years old. You don't know what love is. Just because you've never... I started, then stopped. But it was too late. Her face went cold, colder than I'd ever seen it. Never what, David? Never loved you? Is that what you think? I should have backed down then, should have apologized, shrunk back into my usual role. Instead, I stood straighter. I think you love the idea of who you want me to be, but you've never loved who I actually am. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You're right. I don't love who you are. Because who you are is selfish, ungrateful, and weak. You want to throw away everything this family has given you for some girl and some computer classes? Fine. But don't expect me to watch you do it. I don't expect anything from you anymore. Good. Because after today, you're not getting it. You want to make your own choices? Then you can make them somewhere else. You're not my son anymore, David. You stopped being my son the moment you decided we weren't good enough for you. I packed that night. Dad helped me carry my boxes to the car, his face carefully neutral. Emily cried and begged me not to go, which somehow made it worse. If she could see that this was wrong, why couldn't they? Mom watched from the kitchen window as I loaded the last box. Our eyes met for a moment through the glass, and I hoped she might come outside, might say something. Anything. Instead, she turned away and switched off the light. The first year was brutal. I lived in my car for 3 weeks before finding a studio apartment above a Chinese restaurant. The smell of garlic and soy sauce seeped through the floorboards, and the fluorescent light in the bathroom flickered constantly. I worked construction during the day and took community college classes at night, saving every penny for a transfer to a 4-year school. My hands cracked and bled from the cold that first winter. I'd never done real manual labor before, and my soft suburban hands weren't prepared for concrete and rebar. The other guys on the crew were decent enough, but I was clearly the college boy playing at being working class. They weren't wrong. Sarah and I tried to make it work long distance, but it was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. She was thriving at her engineering program, making friends, building a life. I was barely surviving, calling her from payphones because I couldn't afford a cell plan. When she finally told me she thought we should see other people, I wasn't even surprised. I was disappointed in myself for not being stronger, for not being enough. The loneliness was the hardest part. I'd grown up in a house full of voices, even if most of them were critical or dismissive. At least they were there. Now I came home to silence every night. I'd eat cereal for dinner standing at the kitchen counter, then fall asleep to the sound of cars passing on the street below. Some nights, I'd pick up the phone to call home. I'd dial all but the last number, then hang up. What would I say? That I was sorry? That I'd made a mistake? That I missed the sound of Emily's laugh, even Dad's disappointed sighs? I wasn't sorry. And that realization scared me more than the loneliness. It took me 6 years to finish my degree, working full-time and taking classes part-time. Computer science, just like I'd planned. Mom was right about one thing. It was solitary work. But she was wrong about it being cold. Code had logic, structure, rules that made sense. If you wrote something correctly, it worked. If it didn't work, there was always a reason, and you could find it and fix it. I wish families worked the same way. After graduation, I landed a job at a small software company in Portland. Nothing glamorous, but it was mine. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment with a view of nothing special, bought my first new car, started building something that looked like a life. 5 years later, I started my own company with 2 colleagues from my old job. We specialized in database management for small businesses, not sexy, but profitable. By the time I was 30, we'd been acquired by a larger firm for an amount that would have impressed even my mother. By 35, I was financially independent, living in a house I'd bought with cash, driving cars I actually wanted instead of cars I could afford. But I never told them. Not a word. Not out of spite. Though there was some of that, I'll admit. Mostly because I'd learned to live without their approval. The boy who once desperately wanted his mother to hang his drawing on the refrigerator had grown into a man who could buy his own refrigerator. And his own house to put it in. I thought about them, of course. Wondered if Emily had become the artist Mom always believed she would be. Wondered if Dad still worked late to avoid coming home to tension. Wondered if Mom ever looked at that strawberry magnet on the refrigerator and remembered the drawing she'd thrown away. But I didn't call. Didn't send letters or birthday cards. I'd built my life carefully, deliberately, like code that ran clean and didn't crash. Their absence had become part of the architecture. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March while I was reviewing quarterly reports. Unknown number from my old area code. I almost didn't answer. David, it's your Aunt Patricia. I hadn't heard my aunt's voice in 15 years. She sounded older, shakier. Hi, Pat. How did you get this number? It wasn't easy. I had to call your old company, then another company, then finally some secretary took pity on me. She paused. David, I'm calling about your mother. My stomach dropped. Is she? She's alive, but she's very sick. Kidney failure. She's been on dialysis for 2 years, but it's not working anymore. She needs a transplant. I set down my pen and stared out the window at the Portland skyline. I'm sorry to hear that. David, they tested Emily and your father. Neither of them are compatible donors. They need to test other family members. Another pause. You're her son. There's a good chance you could be a match. Son? The word hung in the air like smoke. Have you told her you're calling me? No, she doesn't know. She wouldn't want me to call. She's still proud, David, still stubborn. But she's also dying. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine my mother hooked up to machines. Her careful composure finally cracked. It should have given me some satisfaction. Instead, it just made me feel hollow. I'll think about it. David. I said I'll think about it. I flew to Chicago 3 days later. I told myself I was just going to get tested, to see if I was compatible. Just information. I could always walk away. The hospital was one of those gleaming new buildings that tried too hard to not look like a place where people died. All glass and natural light and abstract art that was supposed to be soothing, but somehow made everything feel more clinical. Emily was in the family waiting area when I arrived. 15 years, and she still looked like the girl who'd drawn that butterfly. A little older, a few lines around her eyes, but fundamentally unchanged. She was wearing a flowy dress and expensive-looking jewelry, the kind of effortless style that came from never having to choose between rent and groceries. She looked up when I walked in, and her face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been joy before it closed off into caution. David. M. We stared at each other across the waiting room like diplomats from warring nations. You look good, she said finally. Different, but good. I did look different. The construction work had filled out my frame, and 15 years of running my own company had given me a confidence I'd never had as a kid. I was wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, though she wouldn't know that. You look the same, I said, and meant it as a compliment. Dad's with her now. The doctors are explaining the dialysis schedule, medication, all that. She twisted her wedding ring. I noticed she was married now, though I didn't ask about her husband. They didn't expect you to come. I'm not sure I expected it either. But you're here. I'm here. The silence stretched between us, filled with 15 years of unspoken words. Finally, Emily sighed. She never stopped loving you, you know. She doesn't know how to show it. She never did. I thought about all the times I'd wanted to hear someone say that. Now it just sounded like another excuse. Did she send you to tell me that? God, no. She'd probably have a heart attack if she knew you were here. I'm glad you came. Whatever happens. Dad appeared in the doorway then, looking exactly as I remembered, but somehow smaller. His hair had gone completely gray, and he moved like someone carrying an invisible weight. His eyes found mine, and for a moment, his carefully controlled expression cracked. David, son. The word hit me like a physical blow. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Thank you for coming. I know this can't be easy. Easy. Nothing about this family had ever been easy. How is she? I asked. Scared, angry, stubborn as ever. He almost smiled. She doesn't want anyone to see her like this. She's lost weight, and the treatments make her tired. You know how she is about appearing weak. I did know. My mother had never let anyone see her cry, never admitted to being wrong, never showed anything but complete control. The idea of her vulnerable and dependent would be her worst nightmare. Can I see her? Dad and Emily exchanged glances. She doesn't know you're here, Emily said. We thought, maybe it would be better if you got tested first. See if you're even a match before. Before we opened old wounds, I understood. The testing took most of the day. Blood work, genetic screening, psychological evaluation. The transplant team was thorough and professional, explaining the risks and recovery time with the same detached competence I used when discussing technical specifications with clients. There was a 60% chance I'd be a compatible donor. If I was, the surgery would be scheduled as soon as possible. Mom's condition was deteriorating rapidly. I'd be in the hospital for a week, off work for 6 to 8 weeks, and there would be lifelong follow-up care to monitor my remaining kidney. Do you have questions about the procedure? The surgeon asked. I had plenty of questions, but none of them were medical. What do you say to someone who threw you away 15 years ago? How do you forgive someone who never asked for forgiveness? How do you save someone's life when they've already made it clear your life doesn't matter to them? When will you know if I'm a match? Tomorrow morning. We'll call you with the results. I spent the night in a hotel near the hospital, staring at the ceiling and remembering things I'd tried to forget. The birthday when she forgot to buy me a present but had Emily's gift wrapped and waiting on the kitchen counter. The Christmas morning when she spent an hour photographing Emily opening her presents, but didn't take a single picture of me. The way she'd introduce Emily as my daughter, the artist, but never seemed to know what to call me. And mixed in with all of that, because memory is cruel and complicated, I remembered other things. The way she'd stay up all night when I had the flu, checking my temperature every hour. How she'd helped me practice my multiplication tables, patiently going through them over and over until I got them right. The fierce pride in her voice when she told her sister I'd made honor roll. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe she had loved me in her limited, conditional way. Maybe I'd just never been the kind of son she could love easily. The call came at 8:17 a.m. I was a match, close to perfect, according to the surgeon. We could proceed with the surgery as early as next week. I need to think about it, I told him. Of course, but don't think too long time isn't on our side here. I hung up and sat on the edge of the hotel bed, holding the phone like it might explode. I could be on a plane back to Portland in 3 hours. I could return to my carefully constructed life and pretend this call had never happened. No one could blame me for walking away, certainly not after what she'd said to me. You're not my son anymore. But I was still her son, wasn't I? Biology didn't care about harsh words or wounded pride. DNA didn't recognize disownment. I got dressed and drove to the hospital. I found her room on the 4th floor. Dad was dozing in a chair beside her bed, and Emily was nowhere to be seen. Through the partially open door, I could see my mother for the first time in 15 years. She looked impossibly small under the hospital blankets. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and slightly yellow from the kidney failure. Her hair, always perfectly styled when I was growing up, was thin and limp. But even diminished, even sick, she carried herself with that familiar, rigid dignity. She was awake, staring out the window at the parking garage across the street. I wondered what she was thinking about. Whether she was afraid. Whether she ever thought about the son she'd thrown away. I must have made a sound, because she turned her head toward the door. Our eyes met, and the world stopped. I watched her face cycle through the same emotions Emily's had. Surprise, recognition. Something that might have been longing before it hardened into the familiar mask of control. She didn't say anything. Just looked at me like I was a ghost she'd been expecting but dreading to see. I stepped into the room, and Dad stirred in his chair. "David, the test results? I'm a match." Mom's eyes never left my face. I could see her throat working, like she was trying to swallow words. That's wonderful news," Dad said, though he sounded more worried than relieved. "When can they schedule the surgery?" "Next week if I agree to do it." The word "if" hung in the room like a challenge. Mom's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course you don't have to," she said, her voice hoarse but still carrying that edge of judgment I remembered. "I'm sure you have important things to get back to." There it was, the assumption that I was selfish, that I'd prioritize my own concerns over her life. Even now, even facing death, she couldn't resist twisting the knife. I could have told her about my company, my success, my house and cars and investment portfolio. Could have thrown my accomplishments in her face like she'd thrown my childhood drawings in the trash. Instead, I pulled a chair up to her bedside and sat down. "Tell me about the treatments. How long have you been sick?" It wasn't the conversation either of us had expected to have. But talking about medical facts was safer than talking about anything else. She told me about the gradual kidney failure, the twice-weekly dialysis sessions that left her exhausted and nauseated. Dad filled in details she left out, how she'd hidden the severity of her condition for months, how she'd refused to let them contact me even when the doctor said she needed a living donor. "I didn't want to be a burden," she said, not quite looking at me. "You've never been a burden," I almost said. "You've been an absence." But I kept that to myself. Emily returned with coffee and nearly dropped the tray when she saw me sitting there. "David, are you?" "I'm a match." She started crying tears of relief and gratitude and 15 years of accumulated sorrow. She hugged me, and for a moment, I let myself remember what it felt like to be part of this family. "Thank you," she whispered against my shoulder. "Thank you for coming back." But I hadn't come back, not really. I was just visiting. The surgery was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent the intervening days in a strange limbo, staying at the hotel and making daily visits to the hospital. Emily tried to fill the silence with stories about her life. Her husband Mark, who taught high school English, their struggles with infertility, her part-time job at an art gallery. She was trying so hard to rebuild 15 years of connection in a few days. Dad was quieter but present, asking carefully neutral questions about my life in Portland. I gave him carefully neutral answers. Yes, I liked my job. No, I wasn't married. Yes, Portland was a nice city. I didn't mention that I owned the company or that I'd bought a house in the hills with a view of Mount Hood. Those details would have required explanations I wasn't ready to give. Mom and I barely spoke directly. Our conversations were mediated through doctors and nurses and medical procedures. She submitted to the pre-surgery preparations with grim efficiency, asking clinical questions about recovery times and success rates. She never once asked how I felt about giving up a piece of my body to save her life. The night before the surgery, I couldn't sleep. I walked down to the hospital cafeteria around midnight and found Dad there, slumped over a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "Couldn't sleep either?" I asked, sliding into the chair across from him. He looked up, startled. "David, no, my mind won't quiet down." We sat in silence for a while, surrounded by the hum of vending machines and the distant sound of hospital monitors. "I should have called you," he said finally. "After you left. I should have picked up the phone. Why didn't you?" He sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "Because I was a coward. Because it was easier to let your mother make the rules than to fight her. Because I told myself you were better off without us. Maybe I was." He winced like I'd hit him. "Maybe you were. But we weren't better off without you." I wanted to ask him why he'd let her throw me away. Why he'd chosen keeping the peace over protecting his son. Why 15 years of birthdays and holidays and life milestones had passed without a single phone call. But he looked so broken sitting there that I didn't have the heart to press. "She loves you, you know," he said. She doesn't know how to show it without controlling it. She thinks love means making sure you make the right choices, become the right kind of person." "And what kind of person is that?" "The kind who doesn't leave. The kind who stays and fits into the shape she's carved out for you." I thought about that, about the David-shaped hole I'd left behind, and whether it had ever been big enough to hold who I actually was. "I'm not coming back," I told him. "After the surgery, I mean. I'm not coming home." He nodded like he'd expected that. "Will you? Would it be okay if I called you sometimes? Just to see how you're doing?" I considered it. The idea of carefully scheduled phone calls, superficial updates, the slow rebuilding of something that had never been strong to begin with. Maybe, in a while, when we've both figured out what we actually want to say to each other. Fair enough. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence, two men trying to span 15 years of distance in the fluorescent glow of a hospital cafeteria. The surgery went smoothly. 4 hours of general anesthesia while they removed my left kidney and transplanted it into my mother's body. I woke up groggy and sore, with a line of staples across my abdomen and a morphine drip that made the world feel soft around the edges. Mom was in surgery for another 2 hours. The transplant procedure was more complex than the removal. But the kidney started working immediately, the surgeon told me later. Her body had accepted it without rejection, and her numbers were already improving. I spent 3 days in the hospital. 3 days of watching my family try to figure out how to be grateful without reopening old wounds. Emily brought flowers and magazines and sat beside my bed, filling the silence with nervous chatter. Dad hovered anxiously, asking the nurses questions they'd already answered and bringing me ice chips I didn't want. Mom was 2 rooms down the hall, recovering from her own surgery. I could have visited her, should have visited her. But every time I thought about walking down that corridor, my chest tightened with an emotion I couldn't name. Not anger anymore. I'd left most of that behind years ago. Something closer to grief, maybe. The grief of wanting something I'd never had and knowing I probably never would. On my last day in the hospital, she came to see me. Dad wheeled her down the hall in a hospital wheelchair, an oxygen cannula under her nose and an IV pole trailing behind her. She looked better already. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes were clearer. "I wanted to thank you," she said without preamble. "For what you did." I nodded. "How are you feeling?" "Better. The doctors say the kidney is working perfectly. No signs of rejection." We stared at each other across the small hospital room. There was so much we could have said, should have said. Apologies and explanations and 15 years of unspoken hurt. Instead, we talked about discharge instructions and follow-up appointments and physical therapy. She never said she was sorry, never admitted she'd been wrong to throw me away, never acknowledged that I'd grown up to become someone worth knowing. And I realized, sitting there with morphine dulling the edges of everything, that I was okay with that. I'd stopped needing her apology years ago. "I know you probably won't want to stay in touch," she said, as Dad prepared to wheel her back to her room. "I know there's too much history, but I want you to know that I'm grateful, and I'm proud of who you've become." It was as close to an admission of love as she was capable of giving. As close to an acknowledgement that she'd been wrong about me as her pride would allow. "Take care of yourself," I told her. She nodded and let Dad wheel her away. I watched them disappear around the corner and felt something inside my chest finally unclenched. A knot of tension I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. I was discharged the next morning. Emily drove me to the airport, trying not to cry as she helped me with my bag. "You'll call, right? Let us know how you're healing?" "I'll call. And maybe you could visit sometime, when you're feeling better, when things aren't so complicated." I hugged her goodbye at the security checkpoint. She felt small in my arms, fragile in a way that reminded me of how young she'd been when I left. She'd been just a kid then, caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. It wasn't her fault that she'd been the favorite, any more than it was my fault that I hadn't been. "Take care of them," I said, though I knew she already was. Emily had always been the glue holding our fractured family together. "Take care of yourself," she said back. Recovery was harder than I'd expected. 6 weeks of limited activity, of measuring my strength in increments of stairs climbed and hours spent upright. I worked from home, participating in conference calls from my couch and reviewing code with my laptop balanced on my chest. But the physical healing was easier than the emotional processing. I'd given part of my body to someone who had rejected me, saved the life of someone who had told me I wasn't her son. I'd done it freely, without conditions or expectations of gratitude. And I still wasn't sure why. My therapist? Yes, I'd started seeing someone after the surgery, finally accepting that some wounds need professional attention, had theories. She talked about breaking cycles of hurt, about choosing compassion over revenge, about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. "You didn't forgive her because she deserved it," she said during one of our sessions. "You forgave her because you deserved to stop carrying that anger." Maybe she was right. Maybe I'd given my mother my kidney not as an act of love, but as an act of liberation. A way of proving to myself that I could be better than the worst thing that had been done to me. Emily called every few weeks to update me on Mom's recovery. The kidney was working well. Her energy was returning. She was back to her old controlling self. Though Emily said this with affection rather than frustration. Dad had started a vegetable garden and was forcing Mom to eat more healthily. Emily and Mark were considering adoption after years of fertility treatments. Mom never asked to speak to me during these calls, and I never asked to speak to her. We existed in parallel lives, connected by blood and history, but separated by choices neither of us seemed willing to unmake. 3 months after the surgery, I got a card in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside, a simple thank you note. "David, I hope you're recovering well. The doctors say I'm doing beautifully. Thank you for giving me my life back." It wasn't an apology or an invitation back into the family. It wasn't an admission of love or regret. It was just acknowledgement of what I'd done, of what it had cost me, of the fact that I existed and mattered, at least enough to warrant a thank you note. I put the card on my refrigerator next to a grocery list and a takeout menu. It looked small and ordinary there, but somehow that felt right. Not everything has to be dramatic or transformative. Sometimes a simple thank you is enough. A year later, I'm sitting in my home office in Portland, reviewing quarterly reports while rain patters against the windows. My scar has faded to a thin silver line, barely visible unless you know where to look. My remaining kidney works overtime but manages the load without complaint. I have regular checkups to make sure everything stays healthy, and so far, so good. I think about my family sometimes. Wonder if Mom still gets tired easily, if Dad's gardens survive the winter, if Emily and Mark ever decided about adoption. But I don't call, and they don't call me. We've settled into a comfortable distance close enough to care, far enough apart to avoid the sharp edges of our shared history. People ask me sometimes why I did it, why I gave a kidney to someone who had disowned me. They expect a story of reconciliation, of love conquering all, of a family made whole through forgiveness. The truth is messier and less satisfying. I did it because I could. Because I had something she needed and the power to choose whether to give it. Because somewhere in that hospital room, looking at her small and scared and trying so hard to maintain her dignity, I saw not just my mother but a person facing death. And I couldn't let someone die when I had the power to save them, even if that someone had hurt me. But mostly, I did it for the 8-year-old boy who had watched his drawing get thrown away, who had spent years trying to earn love that was always conditional, always just out of reach. I did it to prove that he could grow up to be better than the people who had failed him, that he could choose compassion even when compassion hadn't been shown to him. I did it not for her. I did it for myself, because I know what it feels like to be abandoned, to be told you don't matter, to be discarded like a piece of trash. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone, not even the person who had made me feel that way. The rain has stopped, and weak sunlight is filtering through the clouds. I close my laptop and walk to the kitchen to make coffee. On the refrigerator, the thank you card is still there, a little faded now, but still legible. Next to it is a photo Emily sent me, her and Mark with their new daughter, adopted from South Korea. They named her Grace. I don't know if I'll ever see Grace in person, if I'll ever be Uncle David instead of just a name mentioned occasionally in family stories. I don't know if my mother and I will ever have a real conversation, if my father and I will ever get past small talk and weather reports. What I do know is that I'm free. Free from the need for their approval, free from the weight of their disappointment, free from the childhood fantasy that if I just tried hard enough, I could make them love me the way I needed to be loved. I saved my mother's life, and in doing so, I saved my own, not from death, but from the slow poison of carrying someone else's rejection. I gave her my kidney, but I kept my dignity. I kept my peace. I kept the life I'd built for myself, brick by careful brick, in the 15 years since she told me I wasn't her son anymore. I am her son, biologically and irrevocably. But I'm also more than that. I'm David, not the David she wanted me to be, but the David I chose to become. And that's enough. Finally, after all these years, that's enough.